This is your second lecture for our Introduction to Philosophy, and in this lecture we'll be looking at the wisdom traditions presented in Asia well over 2,000 years ago. We begin by understanding some terms to help us understand what the ancient Chinese cosmology would have looked like. First important term here is Tian, and Tian is the term that is most often translated as heaven. Now, while this concept of heaven does have some things in common with the Western concept of heaven as a place of a personal afterlife, such as the Chinese believe that their ancestors would go to Tian after death. More importantly for the Chinese, Tian, or heaven and earth, are intertwined, and in the present reality that these people are all living in. But the difference between Tian and earth is that earth is broken and its citizens are therefore corrupt and immoral. And heaven, or Tian, is representing what the earth is intended to be or grow into. Tian also has an energy called the Tao, better understood as the way or the path. The Tao is comprised of two opposing forces, the Yin, which represents darkness, passivity, and femaleness, and the Yang, which represents light, activity, and maleness. The symbol that you all have probably seen many places before on this slide is your most typical rendering of the Yin and the Yang. You can see here that not only are the two conjoined, but they also interpenetrate one another, as you can see in a circle of white within the black and a circle of black within the white. The Tao holds the two forces in a perfect balance. Within the ancient Asian philosophies, the primary teachers were called sages, and they were not concerned with metaphysics or ontology, but instead their primary concern or focus was on ethics and conduct in their respective societies. The first of three primary teachers that we're looking at in this lecture is Lao-Tzu. Lao-Tzu's philosophy is often referred to as Taoism, and is also believed to be practiced religiously. His legend describes him becoming a forest hermit at the age of 160, having grown to a place of disdain for what has happened to society. He's going to live the rest of his life as an ascetic out in the forest. As he passes through the gate of the city to make his exit, there is a guard there, and the guard asks him for an offering of his wisdom. Lao-Tzu provides the guard with his teachings, and these are compiled in a book that will later be called the Tao Te Ching, and this is one of the most formative books for Chinese philosophical outlook. The philosophy describes the Tao as having an energy called qi. Now, I'm introducing some things here that are not in your textbook at all, so you'll need to pay careful attention at this point. Now, the Tao has this energy called qi. The qi is what joins the yin and the yang together. It acts as a magnet conjoining the two. And there is a practice within Taoism that is called Feng Shui, and it's based in a text called the I Ching. Here is what this looks like. If you're wanting to get in touch with the qi so that you can be on the path of the Tao, you would take 6 sticks in your hand, or 6 coins in your hand, and you would throw them down on a table or on the ground, and then you would make a record of how many of the sticks are pointing east-west and how many are pointing north-south. And you would record what the pattern is with each of the 6 sticks, and then you would throw down the sticks again, and you would continue to repeat this pattern. Or you could do the same thing with coins, and you would make a note whether it was heads or tails each time. And then you would consult the manual of the I Ching, and whatever your philosophical question would be, it would be answered in the I Ching according to the pattern that the sticks or the coins had fallen in, and that would the I Ching would therefore help you connect with the qi, that energy that would place you on the correct path, the balanced path, the path of harmony known as the Tao. Now, Lao-Tzu stresses a virtue that is called Wu Wei, and it's a seemingly contradictory phrase. Literally, it means inactive activity, so it's a contradiction. It teaches that the Tao has a certain flow, like that of a stream, and if we try to force an action, we will become imbalanced. Instead, we should be passively seeking. Now realize that phrase right there is also contradictory, or at least paradoxical. Passively seeking. How can you seek if you're being passive? But that is part of the teaching of Taoism and the Tao Te Ching, that this is a truth, a wisdom beyond what words can describe. But anyway, within Wu Wei, you hope to find yourself sort of floating in this stream, this path of the Tao, and that will keep you in balance and harmony in the way that you should live your life. Our next sage or philosopher is Confucius, and Confucius is primarily concerned with politics. One of the reasons for this we see in his family background. We're at a period in China's history when we have many warring factions and one dynasty taking over another dynasty. And Confucius' family had been held in high favor by the previous dynasty. But because they had been shown favoritism by a previous dynasty, that means the current dynasty frowns upon Confucius and his family. And so Confucius in his early life actually faces persecution. And so having endured this injustice, Confucius is led to develop a political philosophy that he believes will create a more balanced and peaceful society. And the most important text that describes his philosophy is called the Analects. Now, similar to the internal balance and harmony of being in tune with the key of the Tao, we have within Confucius' teachings Cheng, or translated in English, the golden mean, or the golden balance. And this was taught by Confucius as the balance and harmony of our actions, most especially ethical actions toward others. Now, many teachers in the past have taught that what Lao-Tzu teaches and what Confucius teaches are at odds with one another. I'd like to propose an alternative to you, that these two teachings can actually be held together, that Lao-Tzu is focused on the internal individual balance, and that Confucius is looking outward into society to find balance and harmony within community. And that's what we mean by politics. And within politics, you can hear the Greek word polis, which means city. And so politics is dealing with the community, the city, and the relationships and laws within that community or society. Now, the person who chooses to live with this golden mean, this Cheng that Confucius described, is often called a Chunsu, which means the superior man. Now, this has to do with how a person uses his or her resources or talents. Within the language here, it's called Te, your Te, or whatever resources or talents you might have. So do you use those things to help others or to hurt others, to bring about greater balance and justice within your society, or to bring about greater imbalance and injustice within your society? If you use your resources and talents, your Te, for good, then you're a Chunsu, the superior man. But the person who uses his Te to harm or neglect others is called the Sao Jin. Jin is actually a word which means intentionally acting with virtue toward others, and Sao is a term of negation. So the one who is not using Jin correctly, the one who is not acting with virtue toward others. And so the Chunsu and the Sao Jin, the superior man and inferior man, are posed against one another within Confucius philosophy. Now, geographically, Siddhartha Gautama Buddha has a very different beginning than Confucius or Lao-Tzu. Although the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama will eventually have an enormous impact upon not only China but also Japan and Korea, it is important to note that the beginning of the Buddha's teachings arise in a Hindu village in northeast India. This is where Siddhartha's father was the equivalent of a king, and his father, Suddhodana, the name is not on the slide, so you don't have to worry about getting that in your notes. But King Suddhodana, Siddhartha's father, wants to keep his son from knowing about the suffering in the world, and so he keeps him within the palace walls and tries to see to it that Siddhartha only has pleasures and good things and lives a life of ease. But one day Siddhartha escapes the palace, and in the streets in the village he sees suffering for the first time. He sees poverty, he sees sickness, physical disabilities that come with old age, and then he also sees a dead body, and so he sees death. He also, during this wandering, comes across a sannyasin. Now, this is not a word found in your textbook, so please pay close attention here. A sannyasin would typically be someone who reaches the age of 75 and has been very committed to the Hindu faith. And at 75, you are intended to become an ascetic monk, someone who moves away from society and moves away from many of life's pleasures, not just pleasures, but also needs. Usually a sannyasin is extremely emaciated because he is not eating. Also would be sleep deprived, and so a sannyasin is someone who gives up many things, hoping that in that sacrifice he can find some sort of peace or enlightenment. And so Siddhartha decides to follow this path of extreme asceticism and sacrifice, but after 7 years of this, he's had no experience of coming to peace with the world's suffering. And so he comes across a new idea that he will call the middle way, and so he begins to live moderate. He doesn't starve himself, but he doesn't overeat also. It's really not a just picture of the Buddha that you see him often as very plump. I think what we see here is more of an accurate depiction of someone who is living again in this middle way, this moderate lifestyle of certainly eating but not indulging. And one day, while living in this middle way, he becomes the Buddha, an enlightened one. Buddha is a title, not a name, and there are many Buddhas within Buddhism. And so Siddhartha Gautama becomes a Buddha, becomes an enlightened individual who is able to escape earth for the peace of a state or a place called nirvana. But Siddhartha Gautama decides to stay on earth and share his enlightenment with others. There's actually a devil or satanic type figure within Buddhism called Mara, and it says that as Buddha is on his way to leave nirvana to come back to earth to teach others, Mara is trying to tempt the Buddha to stay in this state of nirvana and not to go back and help others. But we do have Siddhartha Gautama deciding to leave nirvana, to come back to earth, to leave this place of enlightenment, to come back to earth, to teach others the path to enlightenment. And so one who does this, who chooses to delay the reception of nirvana, is called a bodhisattva. And so we do have Siddhartha Gautama spending the rest of his life as a bodhisattva before he dies at the age of 80 after what appears to be accidental food poisoning. Okay, we have to remember that the Buddha's primary students would have been from the Hindu tradition, and the Buddha, with part of his teachings, actually challenged the traditional teaching of what karma is. Now, most of you have heard the term karma before and probably have a rudimentary understanding of what it means. Karma surmises that all of our actions, words, and thoughts carry an ethical or moral weight, and that will revisit us, good for good or bad for bad. So if you're doing good things for other people, then good things will be done for you. If you're doing bad things to other people, then bad things will come upon you. Now the Buddha observed that the good also suffer, and so this is where he begins to challenge karma, and certainly will not dismiss karma, that karma does hold some value, but also we must realize that karma is something that is not always going to be held as true for everyone, because suffering is universal. It's not just the bad who suffer, but also the good who suffer. And so the Buddha teaches the 4 following noble truths. Number 1, life is full of suffering. And what a great word you have for suffering here, dukkha. Dukkha is translated as suffering. So life is full of suffering. Number 2 of the truths, desire is the cause of suffering. It's because you desire things that you suffer when those desires are not met. And so number 3, if desire can be overcome, then it would make sense that suffering can also be overcome. And then lastly, the Buddha would unpack these truths with the final statement here that the Eightfold Path is the way that you overcome desire and thus overcome suffering. Now, this picture that you have on the right here is a journey you can see of a monk, a monkey, and an elephant on this pathway up to a mountain, and the mountaintop would be considered nirvana. And you can tell that there is disarray and confusion here down at the bottom part of the path. Things are out of control. and then you begin to have the animal change colors. Both animals, the monkey and the elephant, change colors as they begin to move up the pathway, and the confusion you can see start to lessen, and there is a peace, and eventually we have the monkey and the monk become conjoined, so the animal side of man and the spiritual side of man have come together, and then we have finally the monk at top, the elephant, and then you can see the monk soaring into the sky at the very top. So this is a picture within a Buddhist tradition of what the pathway toward enlightenment looks like. Now let's take a look here at what we have in the Eightfold Path. They are traditionally divided into three groups. That the first two parts of the path deal with understanding. Steps 3, 4, and 5 pertain to particular actions that must be completed, and 6, 7, and 8 pertain to practices that must continue for enlightenment to eventually take place. Okay, number 1 is right understanding, that you have an understanding. Another word you might want to put here is self-awareness. Okay, you have a correct sense of yourself, a right understanding. Number 2, also that you have come to understand what a purpose would be for your life. And so it's not that you have achieved the purpose yet, but you understand what a purpose for your life would be. And so now we move into particular actions. Number 1, let's make sure that you have the right words, the right speech, what comes out of your mouth. Number 4, right conduct, the way that you treat others. And number 5, the right vocation or the right livelihood. Maybe you call it a job or a career, but that you are invested your life in some sort of work or vocation that fits with that prior understanding and purpose of who you are. And now for disciplines that must continue throughout a lifetime. You've got to have right effort in all of your endeavors. Also, a right awareness, being aware of what's going on not just within you but around you. And then also, Buddhism is a philosophy, some would even call a religion, that focus heavily upon different forms of meditation, so that you would discover what meditation draws you further into enlightenment. Now, there's a more modern version of this Eightfold Path that you can find on page 52 of your textbook, and I find it to be quite helpful, and you may also.